E passo la parola a John Akeroyd, consulente ricercatore per la UCL di Londra. Dear John, it's your turn. Ok?
Thank you, Enzo. Buongiorno a tutti. Let me share my screen, please.
You can share it. You're able.
Have I shared my screen?
Not yet, John, no.
Matteo, lui è abilitato, giusto? Ok.
Okay. Okay. I have only a few minutes, 5-10 minutes to present this morning. So I should be very brief and give you a summary, some of which Enzo has already covered. My starting point was the context. Wasn't that my starting point was the context of the legal framework that's emerging across the world, particularly in Europe. And as I say, Enzo has kind of covered this, so therefore I'm going to move fairly quickly beyond it. But it's just to say that these legal frameworks and local and state policies are pushing organizations to improve accessibility at almost every level, particularly I think this date of 28th of June 2025 for publishers to come in behind accessibility standards. Mainly what I wanted to talk about was the problems that universities have with the content that they possess. And universities, like any large organization, have enormous amounts of content of one kind or another. I've divided them into two major blocks. So it seems to me this is one of the concerns and one of the issues. On the one hand is that information which is acquired, which is licensed, which is published in commercial information. And generally speaking, that is becoming increasingly accessible at the point of birth. And again, this is where the legal frameworks begin to apply. So we're talking about things like databases, ebooks, e-journals, and so on, which are well managed within a university context. Generally, there are the frameworks and structures in place to deal with it. On the other hand, is the content that's created internally. And this is my major point. That content is very often poorly managed and poorly organized. It's the sort of content that sits in institutional repositories, things like theses or teaching and learning content that maybe sit in either within the learning environment, Moodle in our case, or in other network drives. And it can exist in different kinds of formats, including Word files, HTML files, web pages, PDFs, and on network drives and so on. So that's kind of the major separation between the two. And these things join up together, or that's what we aim to try and do. To provide the kind of total learning experience. So on the one hand, the bibliographic data content sitting within digital libraries. We have the repositories that may be local or corporate, and then brought together through the learning environment at the bottom there. And that's kind of a relatively simple way of describing the fact that learning content can sit in different places within the organization and with varying degrees of management as a consequence. It's actually even more complicated than that. This just builds on that by saying, well, some repositories are internal, some repositories are actually external to the organization, but may need to appear as if they're internal. Sometimes content is sat on institutional services like library management systems, but in other cases you're going outside to publishers' databases. So content is sitting in more than one place at one time. And just to try and summarize that challenge, that problem that exists, the basic argument is that university content in general, especially that which is internally produced and managed, is actually very poorly managed, if it's managed at all. It tends to lack metadata of any substance. It lacks classification, indexing, subject descriptors, which makes it difficult to discover. It generally lacks accessibility, full stop. It also exists in a multiplicity of formats. That is, any given document might have different formats, might exist in different versions, and there are different formats going on across the university, ranging through variations of Word and PDF, and even GDocs and so on. And finally, where documents do exist, they may well have different access mechanisms, different authentication systems in place, unless there's single sign-on and so on, and different licensing agreements in place, just to add to the confusion and to the problems. So those are some of the challenges and problems that exist. One way of trying to deal with the accessibility problem is to try and move towards some standardization in formats. And I'll skip this slide because it's basically saying what I've really just said. Two formats have emerged which are key to accessibility. One being PDF user accessible. PDF UA exists, I guess, because there is so much PDF content around that it's implied a need to ensure that it can be made accessible to some extent. PDF suffers from essentially originally being an image format rather than anything a print format. The second is EPUB, and EPUB 3 in particular has accessibility built as a built-in function requirement. So we're seeing EPUB emerge not just as it originally was propositioned as a standard for ebooks, but in all kinds of other different contexts as well. So even journal articles and so on are being provided via EPUB. And these standards, because they're backed up then by screen readers and so on, do have inherently good levels of accessibility. I might just add HTML5 as another possibility there. So what do universities need to do? Again, Enzo has maybe touched on some of this, but my four key things I think that universities ought to do, and indeed from some of the research we did last year, we found that universities to some extent were doing all of these different levels. But firstly is trying to establish accessible formats across the piece. That's probably through policies or trying to encourage individual teachers to render their content in accessible formats at the outset. It's a matter of deploying regular audits, trying to understand across the whole of the university the extent to which you are complying with accessibility standards. Thirdly, it's having a very strong legal and policy base derived, I guess, from the overall state level or European standards, So my own university has a whole number of fairly strict policies in place that the expectation everybody will follow. And finally, and very importantly, to provide adequate levels of support and guidance to individual teachers. So we've seen many universities establish teams. Again, my university, University College, has a team of 6 people who are simply deployed to support accessibility. Now, we're a very large university. Others may find that level of resource difficult, but we noticed also in France, for example, universities collaborating on disability support, so providing regional or citywide support services, and providing guidance via the web and elsewhere. Sometimes that's virtual, but also just physical guidance, places where disabled students can go and feel supported. So that's all I wanted to say in this brief introduction. And Enzo, I will hand you back across on Zoom.